What up, what up, what up, y'all? Happy Sunday. Y'all know I have been covering this whole BLM thing, this whole money debacle, totally fascinated by it. So I wanted to go a little bit deeper, right? So I brought in a special guest, a superstar guest, to talk more about this issue with Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, to be exact, right? So listen, get your popcorn, get your libations. This is going to be a great show. All right. I've got a great super guest today. Today, I've got award-winning journalist, new best-selling author of his book, The Case for Cancel Culture, Mr. Ernest Owens. How are you, sir?
Awesome. Thanks for having me on.
Good, man. Good, man. Gotta bring it out. Gotta bring it out. I had to call in a few
Awesome.
favors. Get
Yes,
you on here.
absolutely.
So I know we don't have a lot of time today, but I did a show the other day just highlighting the 990, which is the nonprofit tax return of Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. I
Mhm.
want to be clear about that. And just going through it, and it tells quite a story. It tells quite a story. So I wanted to talk to somebody who has done more coverage of Black Lives Matter as a movement than anybody else that I know. So I figured, hey, let's get Mr. Ernest on. So thank you for accepting the invitation, and let's get right into it. So my first question for you is, with all of this new news, all of this new discovery, is Black Lives Matter dead?
That's a really good question. I don't think the movement itself, the people, right, who are on the ground, the activists, those local chapters on the ground are right. Before it was Black Lives Matter, it was the civil rights movement. Even before then, it was abolition, right? The movement and the progression to advocate on behalf of Black people that will never die. I would say that the leadership at the helm, those founders of this particular moment in time who started this particular aspect of the organization, I definitely think their time has passed. I think that their leadership and the way that people view them as the voice, I think that is extinct or going to be extinct. I think that where we are as a society, and I think as a community, specifically with Black people, right? I think we are seeing this information with the 990s. I think we're seeing some of the concerns around the leadership with this particular organization that has put us at pause, rightfully so. But I don't think that just because of some um, bad decision making on part of the founders of Black Lives Matter Global Network, which I want to be very clear, not the activists, the grassroots activists who are doing the work that is not working directly under this organization or loosely affiliated. I'm not speaking about them. That fight will continue. This work will continue beyond this leadership. So I would say to your answer, it's a yes and no. The founders and the leaders of BLM, right? I think that they have lost a lot of credibility within the Black community, and I think that their presence and their prominence, I think that is dying. But I don't think the actual activism, the spirit of the movement, and those people on the ground, I don't think that movement within itself is dead.
So, but I mean, can you really distinguish between the two? I mean, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, or what do they call it, BLM,
Mhm.
GNF, is, can you really distinguish between the two?
I think most people don't, unfortunately. I think most people have just slapped everything with Black Lives Matter. Even organizations that are not Black Lives Matter against Black Lives Matter. I think this reminds me of the 70s when any black radical voice was a member of the Black Panthers Party, even though they weren't a member of the Black Panthers Party. So I think that that's just an era of white people and mass media, right? Where anytime there is a prominent black movement, there's always going to be anyone a part of. I think there was a point in time where any black Muslim voice that was speaking about activism was automatically told they were part of the Nation of Islam or they were a follower of Farrakhan, and it was like not true. But that's just what happens in mass media. So I would say that it is hard sometimes for people to make that distinction, But I just think as Black people, we just should not fall in the trap of like really painting a broad stroke and a broad brush of any activist we see out that's Black and just say Black Lives Matter or just connect them to individuals like Patrice Cullors and others who have been criticized lately.
All right, well let's go back a little bit, right? Let's go back a little bit. I know you've been covering Black Lives Matter for like forever, but what
Yeah.
I mean, and we already know this question, but this is more for the audience. What qualifies you to talk about this?
I think for me, what qualifies me is first being a Black queer journalist. Black Lives Matter really spoke at the intersections between various identities within the Black community, right? It was a very intersectional movement. It was one that was not about a hierarchical structure, which some people for many years criticized, including Oprah Winfrey and others, that felt like, we need to know the face of the movement, the leader. And I think the beautiful thing about the fact that they really did not have that hierarchical structure is that this is exactly why, right? Because if people made the co founders the sole voice and face of the movement, their errors as individuals would seek to dilute a lot of the purpose and the positioning. And people, this is a generational debate among some, right? Older generations are used to that, Messiah like figure, that savior, that leader, that prominence. And I think history has taught us that when you put that much pressure and that much spotlight on one individual, their errors become the errors of the entire movement. It becomes a debt to everyone else. And I don't think that has served us well, in my opinion. So I think what made Black Lives Matter different is that they said, look, all of us have that power. We all have that collective responsibility. And I think that's why it's been able to flourish and integrate within various sectors of society because of that very reason. As far as my interest in my journalism, I mean, this happened during my years in college. The rise of Black Lives Matter happened while I was in college. And as someone who started marching and going to protest and being a part of it on a small level as a college student to now being a journalist, there's a lot of things that I've seen at the very beginning. There's a lot of stuff, people I know that's really closely connected to it. And to be able to articulate and very clarify these stories to the public is something that I just feel like is my right and is also my responsibility.
But couldn't you also argue that this quote unquote non-leaderless organization is suffering because of that? Because again, everybody likes to lump in Black Lives Matter with Black Lives Matter, Global Network Foundation. So wouldn't you think it's also a black eye in the way that they carried that out as well?
I think the issue with them wasn't a problem with leadership. I think it was the issue of management. And I think leadership and management sometimes are the same and then sometimes they're not. I think Black Lives Matter just was not managed properly. And I don't think there necessarily needs to be some designated CEO or president or figurehead, right, to do that. But I also think that what they needed and what they lacked was management. And there's a collectiveness to that, right? Because management is expected to be transparent. Management is expected to make sure that things are in order, and that does not necessarily need a dictator or a particular president or a leader or one figure or that to be there, but just the collective sense of management. I think people really wanted management. They wanted structure. They wanted those things in place. And there's many organizations and groups I know that do not have a hierarchical structure in activism that is able to get the work done because they do work with some level of governance. They
But
lacked that. They lacked a level of structure, I think, that made it hard, right?
think
And
about this
yeah,
real quick, not to cut you off,
yeah,
but
yeah,
think about this. In effect, they did only have a dictator, right? When you look at the 990s, it's only one voting person, and that was Patrice Cullors. I always say her
correct,
name wrong,
correct.
right? So, in effect, they were saying they were kind of anti-dictatorship, anti-messiah, but then that's what kind of burned them in the end. And I will push back and say it wasn't. It was a failure of leadership and management because clearly, I mean, you talked about this a lot, right? Ms. Cullors always says that she was triggered by just thinking about taxes
Yeah,
and everything. But you collected when they first reported $90 million. Now we know it wasn't 90 million. It was 76, almost 77 million. And I think, not I think, I have questions about that too.
Mm-hmm.
because it's, from what I understand, BLM, right, the movement, and many of the local memberships have been asking about transparency
Right.
since 2016.
Yeah, for years.
Right. And so they only formed in 2017. And so it just seems like there's a gap there. So I would just
Well, well,
not
I'll
push
say
back,
this.
but just ask you a little bit about that.
No, I just want to say that to the point. So here's the issue. In the very beginning, the plan was not for it to be a hierarchical structure because Black Lives Matter as a movement had been around way before 2017, right? The issue is that when they decided to become a nonprofit, right? There are some things that you just have to have in place to run a nonprofit. And that is when there was issues, in my opinion. That was when there was a lack of transparency. And so, to be clear, I don't think that the nonprofit aspect of BLM was the activist arm in the ways that we talk about movement work, right? When they became a nonprofit, they need to have a board of directors. They needed to have a more accountable arm, right? Because money began to start coming in. All of that happened. And let's be very clear, the movement and the nonprofit are two different things. So as a movement, it did not, I thought it was a benefit for them not to have that one voice, that one leader, right? Because that made it more democratic as far as the inclusion part. But when they became a nonprofit, right, and this is very important, Black Lives Matter Global Network, that was an entirely different conversation. That's an entirely different structure. And that is when there should have been, individuals stepping up. There should have been a board of directors. Patrice should not have been the only one that solely was, running the ship in that way. And that to me is when it started to spell trouble. Because yes, you can have a movement, right, that is doing their thing out in the streets. And yes, there's advisements and all of that. But when you start talking about the money and you start talking about managing those things, yes, there needs to be leadership in that place. So my critique about Black Lives Matter overall was that, again, these things were not managed properly, right? The distinction between having the movement on the ground and then having the foundation and handling that. And I think what happened was they wanted to do everything the way they did before. When you cross over from that activist to nonprofit sector, you have to have a board of directors. You have to have more accountability. There has to be more structures because you're dealing with the people's money, and there are federal laws and things in place to deal with that, right? The IRS has to deal with that. All of that is there. And so for me, I think the issue for them was they did not understand how to transition from just simply being in movement activist work on a grassroots level to then nonprofit work with millions of dollars on the table. That I think is the real issue, and I think that's what caused the conflict. Because the years before, when I was in college, right, I graduated in 2014. So the years when I was in college and really out of school, there wasn't a conversation about nonprofit. We were just out there in the streets. Everybody was just, you know, following messaging and engaging with other grassroots people. But there were no people that were like simply, oh, we got to file this 990. This person got to file this, whatever. That wasn't the conversation back then because it wasn't. But over the years, once they began to formulate a foundation, it's this very disheartening that the same type of way that they were running the movement on the ground became the same way they were trying to run the nonprofit. And
That
that's just
happens a
not
lot.
right. And that's what the problem was. Like you can't do it like that when you're dealing with millions of dollars on the table. So
Right.
yeah, that
Well,
was
before we get too deep, right, I do feel setting proper context is important.
mhm.
Can you give folks the beginnings of Black Lives Matter, how it started, where it is now, well, not how it started, how it got where it is now, and where do you see it going forward?
Absolutely. So I would say that 2012 was probably the birth of the movement itself, right? Trayvon Martin, who was a young black man, was extrajudicially killed by George. Um,
Flakehead, we even got to say his name. Everybody knows.
this man killed this black man and this young black man, and I remember I was in 2012 when I heard about that. It was in the spring, and from there, public outcry. It wasn't until Mike Brown whose birthday just passed a couple of days ago, when he was killed in Ferguson, that there began to be a really strong movement that was birthed really at that point in Ferguson. There was, of course, Trayvon Martin's passing in 2012, and then Ferguson happened in 2014. And so during that time, there was a hashtag used. There's debated who used the hashtag first, but really, Ferguson in 2014 was when Black Lives Matter really, really blew up and took off. And from there, it became a moment, right? Patrice Cullors and Opal and Alicia Garza, the three of these Black women, two of which are identified as queer, they, really began to be at the face of this movement and really began to mobilize people to have this conversation in a way that wasn't happening, at least in my generation, on this type of scale, right? There were conversations had before, clearly, but I think on that global scale, this hashtag and what it meant ushered in a very different conversation and wave of Black activism for a new generation in the 21st century. And so from then, Black Lives Matter became more than just a hashtag. It became an identity. It became a movement. It became a whole culture within itself. I mean, when you look at the music that ushered in, you look at artists like Kendrick Lamar at that time, you look at a lot of what Beyonce began to do in some of her art, it was a whole argument about putting a value on Black people in a way that not only was about Black excellence and all of that jazz, but also a conversation about policing in America and calling for change. And I think really not just we went past the conversation of abolition, but then beyond the conversation of reform into the conversation of abolition that started in these past couple of years. But of course, so much stuff has happened. I think 2020 was another revival, another boom for Black Lives Matter with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And that took it to another level where at this point, the organization had a foundation. There was money to be raised. When Mike Brown had died, when Trayvon Martin had died, these people, when they were killed, there was no foundation at that point to raise that money to do any of that kind of stuff. So when we get to George Floyd, there is now an established account. At this point, Patrice Cullors is one of the only founders who was still involved with BLM. Alicia Garza, Opal Tomei, all of those two women, they went off and kind of did their own things. Alicia Garza more so with writing a book, doing a podcast. She transitioned into other work, but Patrice Cullors stayed on. And during that time that she stayed on and doing the work, that's when money started coming in, critiques about her leadership, her decision making. That really got to a point where she stepped down last spring due to criticisms about her having the homes and houses. She claimed she was always going to leave around that time, but it just so happens that the announcement in the New York Post about the properties and other questions began to really pile up, that her exit from the BLM Global Network as one of the leaders at the helm began to get really, really interesting. And then since then, there's been nothing but continuous journalism and reporting about BLM's money, their finances, and whatnot, to the point where a big bombshell story came out in the February issue of New York Magazine, which I was one of the writers, part of this big package on 10 years of Black Lives Matter, which they consider starting in 2012. Now we're in January 2022. So it's been 10 years. And yeah, I was like, wow, I was 20 years old. Now I'm 30. Wow, 20 years. And
Time flies.
yeah, it does. When you see what started off with that piece, so Sean Campbell wrote this incredible piece that was a part of that New York Magazine package on Black Lives Matter, talking about where the money went. I did a piece on an organization called Campaign Zero, which is led by DeRay McKesson, which many people have always thought was a part of Black Lives Matter Global Network. He wasn't. He was a protester. He was an activist. He is an activist, I suppose, still. But he wasn't a part of the Black Lives Matter Global Network. I think a lot of times what has happened is that when we see people talking about Black Lives Matter in general, we always attach any Black person to it. Like people always thought Janetta Elzie, who was also a part of Campaign Zero, was Black Lives Matter, or Tamika Mallory. We who else do we talk about? Tamika Mallory. There's also people like
Everybody.
everybody, Sean King. But these people were not a part of Black Lives Matter Global Network. They all had their own groups and things. Like Tamika Mallory has Until Freedom. Sean King has Sean King.
Well, let
Van
me ask you
Jones has
this,
Reform.
right? Because
Huh?
it seems like the BLM 10
Yeah, the tent.
kind of out of Ferguson, after Ferguson happened, then BLM or Black Lives Matter, everything else started to begin. So
Everybody ran off of that. Yeah.
how did, how did BLM Global, oh, I always get it garbled,
Foundation Network.
Global Network Foundation
Mhm.
kind of become the hub, right? How did they become the de facto centerpiece of everything?
Well, I think that I would say that to a certain extent, a lot of these other organizations were inspired by Black Lives Matter, the movement itself. And so people, came to do their own thing. And also, what needs to be clear is that all of these organizations, while they might seem similar, they all have different causes or ways they want to address the issue. So, Black Lives Matter is rooted in abolition. Like they don't
Break
want
that
police
down.
power.
Break down
Abolition, they don't
abolition.
want police. They
Yes.
don't want polices. They don't want prisons. They don't want policing. They don't want a police presence. They believe in community um, governance of that sort. They looking at alternative means, but they don't want police power. Period. Versus organizations like Campaign Zero, they try to do things like reimagining what policing looks like, which is more so in this idea of like police reform measures. Like, if we ask the police not to do these particular step by step things, then that would make the world better. And they come from a framework that they believe they're more realistic. They don't think abolition is attainable in our lifetime or possible. So they're a lot more pragmatic in their approach. They like to try to do policy. They go to the White House. They have a different conversation than what a lot of Black Lives Matter movement is about. Black Lives Matter is more rooted in abolition. The movement for Black Lives, they're rooted in abolition. Other groups are more into police reform measures or conversations with the police that can lead to things to change. It's really a difference between that. Honestly, there's other approaches and things that's more, fine detail. But essentially, a lot of these groups that are either for abolition or they're on police reform. Either or.
Yeah,
That's the difference.
how did Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation become kind of the center? Because
Well,
like
they became the center simply because, I mean, let's be clear. They became the center of this because they had the national attention. They had the posts, they had the streets, they had, I mean, everything that we think about. Like, it's just a catchy name, right? We hear Black Lives Matter, people want to give to that before they will think of any other group because they had the clout, they had the culture, like everything centered around that because they were arguably the first in that group to really establish an identity, and everything that has come since them, good or bad, has been a byproduct of what that name and that slogan means. So essentially, that's why I think they've been the most successful because the name, right? People, when people gave money, they gave money to Campaign Zero, they gave money to other groups, but when they saw Black Lives Matter and they saw that there was an ability for them to write a check, people went there. So it was about branding, essentially. I would say that played a role in that, and they were ahead of the curve. Um,
but do you know that
yeah,
there's probably at least, and I'm guessing right now, I looked at it the other day on our other broadcast, there's probably at least 100 Black Lives Matters nonprofits.
yeah,
And I'm sure the money got separated and splintered and differentiated, but still, Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation got the majority of it. So
yeah.
I
They did,
guess
and they
I'm
did also did because of the fact that they also did have a strong pool, right? Celebrities, pushed
okay.
them. They had the celebrity pool. Like when I say they have the culture, I'm talking about celebrities, mainstream media. They had the gravitational pull that would direct people to funding them and supporting them. I mean, you got corporations that was looking at them. Like they had the eyes of all of these different people that people knew who to go to, the visibility of their co-founders, right? Because Patrice Culler's presence in this really was, drumming up money to a certain degree or directing the funds. I mean, everything was the perfect storm for them. I mean, they worked strategically to do that. So anybody who came out with their own bootleg version was always going to be playing second fiddle to them.
Okay. Okay. Now, I mean, again, part of the reason I find all of this so fascinating is, well, I'm gonna read this text I sent to a lawyer. We both know. Not gonna reveal the names though. This whole BLM situation is fucked. But this is kind of like a microcosm of many Black organizations. It's almost like they're all set up to fail from the beginning. And it just seems like all the activists a lot of times then turn into nonprofits. But they don't want to add the necessary leadership, management, and discipline to do it. And then a lot of times, a lot of people get mad because they gave money or they got money and it wasn't used, it wasn't allocated. Do you find a lot of people are thinking about that or looking at that or anything of that sort of, or am I just a weird one?
No, I think that it's always been something that was said from the very beginning. Sometimes I wonder, and this might be the cynic in me because I do cover a lot of politicians and powerful people that get caught up in corruption or financial problems, that I begin to wonder, with so many people involved in that circle, I would argue, and this is my opinion, that it seems like there was a deliberate choice to fail. I'm not saying that they wanted everything, the organization, to fail directly, but a deliberate choice. There was deliberate choices not to bring leadership and more people there. I think there was people who were dealing with what we consider founder syndrome, where a founder of an organization or a movement or something wants to really bogart a lot of those resources in a way that allows them to do what they want to do because they feel entitled. And it's hard when you go from private to public or from, personal to political. And I think that's what really happened in the situation. I don't think that they were just dumbfounded. I don't personally think that Patrice was just completely dumbfounded and oblivious to how any of this worked. I think it's funny that why I say this is that it's funny how these individuals in their own personal lives, right, with their own careers, had their own speaking agents, had their own teams, had their own people managing their money and their assets and making sure that they had all their stuff together. But then you looking at an organization like, the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation Network, and it seems like none of that stuff was there. Or how funny it is that some of them sat on boards of other organizations and they saw how other nonprofits or organizations are being ran and being done, but somehow they didn't think to themselves, maybe I should bring that expertise to my organization that has bigger budgets than these other organizations that I sit on. So to me, I feel like a lot of this mismanagement was deliberate because they were allowed to make decisions that benefited themselves and their friends and their family in ways that would have not happened if there were people on a board holding them accountable. So I think this was a decision. I think some of this was deliberate
Well, let
because,
me ask you this question.
yeah,
Do you think it was incompetence, negligence, or corruption?
I think all three. I think
Really?
all three. I think all three. I think because like I don't think people were taking the time to really unpack this. These individuals have teams, like lawyers, advisors, agents, people that book them for TV appearances. They sit on boards, they advise other people, they do consulting for other organizations and companies. How in the hell you didn't know? How the hell did you not know? How did you not know that your organization needed these things when you was literally advising other organizations that had those things? Come on.
But
Nah.
Miss Patrice Cullors said she gets triggered when she thinks about taxes and
Yeah,
nonprofits. She says it shouldn't go together.
but
So I
does she pay
mean,
her own taxes? But don't she pay taxes as an individual? Yes, right.
I have no.
She has a team,
Well,
right? She has somebody that handles her finances.
I have no
No,
way to know that answer.
no. I'm telling you that there's no problems with their own personal financial improprieties. None.
Mm,
And
that
so
we
I'm
know of
looking
yet.
at some of this stuff. Listen, like, look, she made sure that she paid her baby father $970,000 for creative services, right? She paid her own brother $840,000 for security, and she
Facts.
gave a fellow director $2.1 million, and she even reimbursed the organization for a $73,000 charter flight she made of her own. So let's be very clear. If there was a board of directors in place, there would have been a lot of checks and balances. There would have been some who was that again? Where's that money going? It would have been checks and balances. I think what people do is they avoid any boards, or they avoid this work, so that what can happen is they could go, oops, I didn't know what happened. But yet you were making all of these decisions, and even within your own conscience as a grown adult, you didn't think to yourself, that might be questionable, that might be a conflict of interest, that might not look good. No, I think people just didn't care. I think it was arrogance. I think that there was a lot of negligence, clearly, and I think it was just a lot of problematic behavior. Like, again, this is a
Mm.
nonprofit, and you got these lucrative, these people are about to be millionaires. You got people out here being millionaires. One of the most triggering things that stood out to me about that 990 was that she gave so much more money to her own personal family than she did foundations that inspired the movement. She didn't give that much money to the Trayvon Martin Foundation, even
I think it
though,
was two. She gave Trayvon Martin 200,000. I think
yeah, about
she gave
200,000.
Michael Brown the biggest. But I looked because again we looked over it. If y'all didn't watch that episode, go back and watch it. But
Yeah.
we Philly Philly Black Lives Matter got 500,000, and then
How
some
much
of
they
the
got?
local affiliate
Yeah.
500,000.
Yeah.
And so to your point, it is like kind of telling like there was all this money, and like you said, the family got more than the actual movement, so to
Right.
speak.
Right. These people became millionaires. Her,
And
her,
for the
her, her
record,
baby daddy, close to being a millionaire. Her brother, close to being a millionaire. Like, they made that off of. I've never heard of an individual security guard getting paid $870,000.
but it could
I've
have been
never
multiple
heard of
people.
it.
It could have been multiple people, and the need for security is absolutely there.
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
and for the record, I admitted this the other day. I'll say it again. I still believe a lot of this was inspired, at least the airing out of it, by right wing media. And so I was hesitant because I don't believe nothing
Mm.
right wing media says for the most part.
I'm gonna
Um,
I'm gonna have to push back.
no, hold on. But
Okay.
the facts are here now. The facts are here. The facts are here, and they gave it all up.
That's a
So
narrative. That's a narrative that needs to stop.
no. But I'm telling you, well, how I felt.
No, I hear you, but this is something that she has said, and it's not true. There has been countless, because I was reporting on this, and I know people who have. There's been countless call-ins. We don't call, when people say "don't call me out," call-ins when people
Mm,
bring you in, right? There was countless call-ins for this organization, whether it was done in private, whether it was done through chapters, whether it was done, through just individual peer to peer. Sometimes the stuff was called out publicly on Twitter threads. I know people who had credible accounts, active Twitter followers, calling all of this out, and they were a part of the movement. And this has been discussed for years. And what happened is that because these people were not as famous, or they weren't considered as important, they definitely intimidated a lot of people from speaking out. I've known people have to relocate on up the other side of the country to get away from some of the blacklisting and bullying. Also, let's also take into account some of the pressure that was happening in newsrooms, right? Predominantly white newsrooms, were in many ways scared to talk about anything negative about BLM because the ideology and narrative was that if you did so, it would be racist or it would be considered racist, or even people who would speak out on Twitter would be doxxed or trolled for criticizing any people. I mean, I criticized Sean King. All of a sudden, here I go getting a bunch of attacks because Sean King wants to, put a tweet of mine up to his followers, and then all they come out like bees attacking me and harassing me. Like I think about Clarissa Brooks, a black young woman who also criticized Sean King, and similar things happen. And that's not Black Lives Global Matter per se, but I'm just saying that these have been the consequences that has happened to some black people who have been in the community or have been a part of the movement that have spoken out publicly. There was a concerted effort to intimidate and silence a lot of people from the very beginning who was questioning the funds, questioning the leadership structure, questioning other things. So let's be very clear. This wasn't just right wing, right? Right wing is always going to find a way to attack black people and organizations. But let's also be clear, throughout all these movements, black people
This
have
was
been
black on
able to
black crime.
see the things that we do, see the stuff that's happening, and we try to point it out, and no one listens to us until white people say something. I
Mm.
mean, I've been very critical about Sean King for years. Now people want to be on trend and white people criticize it, or it's a New York Times story, then all of a sudden, oh wow, look at what these people are saying. Even with this situation that happened with Black Lives Matter, like it took New York Magazine, right, to do a big old glossy story about it, and then everybody wanted to believe it. But what about all these black activists and leaders? They were called haters over the years, right? Oh, if you said something, you hating on the black man, you ain't on the black people, you a hater, you a hater. We were called haters, but then white people become truth tellers, right? Right?
Mm.
White people do. And then when black journalists do it, like I did, like Sean Campbell did, and others, we're considered Benedict Arnolds by some people in the community because we're just not supposed to say anything, right? We're just supposed to be just quiet. Or you just want white people to be the ones to say the things that are happening in our community. And so we have to gather that anti-blackness in our own community when it comes to black people speaking truth to power, when it comes to black journalists that are trying to get to the bottom of these situations. We don't need to wait for white newsrooms and white people to confirm and validate the things that black people within our own community have been saying for years. Patrice likes to play off of the ignorance and the division when saying things like, oh, this is right wing media attack, because that's a dog whistle for black people to go, oh, what? Right wing media? Fox News? Oh, no. Well, they're eating it up anyway. There was
Well,
always a hater.
for the
But let's
record,
be clear,
I didn't,
Yeah.
no, I'm glad you brought that up. Me arriving at that point was before I had even watched like interviews she had. So I was, because Fox was like one of the first people to break it that I recognized.
That
So
you recognize.
I want to be clear
And let's
that
because
I
most people,
recognize.
but let's clear. I'm going to also add this tidbit. This is some tea that a lot of people don't know. There are a lot of black journalists that over the years wanted to write certain stories about BLM, and those stories were killed because editors did not want to deal with the pressure. Liberal, progressive media, right, did not want to deal with the pressure of looking like they were attacking a black organization. Even in my journey of covering issues with an organization called Campaign Zero, I saw how some of those founders and some of those people connected to the organization was doing everything in their power to stop that story from getting published. They didn't want it to be published. And they got connections. These people got connections. Think about with Black Lives Matter, like even these activists, the Sean Kings and all these people, they are friends and cozy up with a lot of the media elite and establishment. They know the producers, they go on the TV shows, they're going to Cabo and hanging out with the journalists. Alicia Garza is out there with the journalists, going on trips and stuff. Like, how do you think that does not play a role in shaping it? I mean, you think about the White House press correspondence dinners, the media events. These people are like homies with these people. They're like cool. They besties. So if you like a person like me, an outspoken journalist that wants to go out and critique some of these people, they look at me like I'm public enemy number one. Oh yeah, we can't have him come on here because he's gonna talk about this person. So this is really a fault of a lot of media conglomerates. Like the reason why it took years for this to happen is because it had to be so glaring, it had to be so bad that finally, after several years of whispers and shutting people out, people like myself, Sean Campbell, other journalists who's been hearing about this for years are finally able to tell these stories and let the public know, because for so long we were either, our pitches were being denied, we were told they weren't interested, or there was always some other backdoor stuff that was stopping the progression. You need to look at some of these people, these media personalities like Mark Lamont Hill, some of these other folks that have had these people in the hot seat and never asked them the real questions until now. Like
No,
they
I
knew
mean
too.
to be
They knew
fair,
too. They knew
Mark
too.
Lamont
They never
when
asked those
he interviewed
questions.
Patrice, he asked the hot questions,
He
and she
asked
fumbled
last
a
year
lot of
after
it.
she was stepping down. Like he asked when
I
the New
thought she
York Post ran
decided
the
to step
story.
down after that interview.
No, it was around the same time because
Okay.
The New York Post had put the story about the mental. He only did it. First of all, let me also break the public y'all down with the media about this. These people go and look for apology stories. Like they go pitching their friends in the media, their homies, right? Stories or opportunities to try to get their apology arc. Like I just saw that Tremaine Lee, who's at MSNBC, did a podcast episode with Patrice to interview her about what's going on. Well, Tremaine had been covering these issues for 10 years. He's been covering Black Lives Matter at the very beginning, an incredible Pulitzer Prize winning Black journalist. I have no issue with him, right? But to be clear, there was a reason why she would do an interview with him, but she didn't want to talk to like New York Magazine, right? She didn't want to talk to some of these other reporters and journalists that she didn't have this previous relationship with or this knowing of. And I think that that's what they do. They go to their friends, they go to people that they have a close relationship with to try to redeem them in ways that other journalists like myself are more interested in holding them accountable.
But wait a minute, that's always been a thing in journalism.
You know, it always has been a thing, but it's a problem when you don't have balance, right? Like, yes, Obama, right, when president, he talked to the people that he knew was going to give him some praise, but he also had the tough conversations with people like Maggie, who was at New York Times, right? He always talked to everybody, or at least gave himself some leverage to get the critique and the pushback. These individuals have been shielded from the media for so long. Like, why is it that who do you know who has been able to have all of these years of millions of dollars in power and influence and not one, no major introspective piece that was challenging or critiquing? Everything was like a script. Like I wrote the first major story about Deidre McKesson, where a profile story of that nature, like a big feature story
Well,
that
hold on,
really challenged and
because
critiqued that.
this is like the third or fourth time you brought it up. Let's just go there now.
Let's do it.
Let's go there now, right? So the rise and rapture of Campaign Zero. Now, part of the reason we're talking about this for everybody that's watching is that D. Ray oftentimes is known as BLM's biggest advocate,
Right.
right, wrong, or indifferent, right? So
Right.
he's tied to Black Lives Matter. So how the founders of one Black Lives Matter's most prominent organization fell apart. Tell us about that.
Yeah, real short because I know it's been so much going on. So Campaign Zero came about in 2015 after Ferguson. Jonetta Elzie, who I've interviewed many times on my own podcast and also for this story, this really starts with her. She was at Ferguson. She's from St. Louis. She saw Mike Brown's blood on that floor, on that concrete. Um, she was one of the first people that was there. She saw all of this, right, in her own backyard. And from there, it started with local grassroots activists that were there in the community that were fed up, including herself. And Deidre McKesson, who's not from Ferguson or from St. Louis, he came from Minnesota, I believe, and kind of just drove down after so many protesters. Days later, Black Lives Matter, the organization, but not really, again, not a nonprofit, but the co-founders came. There's conversations about what role they played, which a lot of people critique them as being just there with the cameras as the protesters were getting hit by the police because there was a lot of increased police aggression. They were just out there on cameras talking to CNN on the cameras, but they weren't really out there on the ground with the people. They had a hotel room that they would go to. But D-Ray went independently. He met Janetta Elsie there. He met um, Brittany Packnett Cunningham, who was also one of the co-founders of Campaign Zero. They connected, and then they kept a bond going that continued to 2015. 2015 is when they really officially founded Campaign Zero with also Sam Sigway, who also joined. And they, for a minute, was basically the reform arm. They didn't believe their organization wasn't at that time about abolition. They were really focused on, police reform measures, creating policies and, trying to change the system within the system. That was their whole situation. So they came up with real strong policy because one of the critiques of the Black Lives Matter movement for a period of time was, what do you all want? What's the ask? Just you know, that was the criticism, right? It was like, oh, you're just out here saying Black Lives Matter or stop police violence, but there wasn't anything that people felt like was policy driven. So Campaign Zero was really that group. They really had a platform. They went to the White House. They talked to politicians all over. They really had these big conversations. But through that time, there became a falling out essentially between D. Ray. Their organization, really began to have some issues between leadership. So Janetta and D. Ray had a falling out. Janetta left. Janetta came back. There was a lot of issues around people taking up attention in space. D. Ray's visibility increased, and it became to be essentially that he was the diva of the group. I mean, he really began to center himself based on the allegations of the other co-founders. Brittany Packnett Cunningham did not speak to me for the story, so to be clear about that. But Sam and Janetta was very clear on the issues and the dysfunction of management. Now, the big change for them happened in 2020 with the racial uprisings. They decided to really shift their organization with more structure. And this is what happens when structure comes into money. They got around 40 something million dollars, I believe, they received, which was some big money.
And there's a
And
problem with the accounting for that too, right?
there was some issues that were raised.
So
But
all these issues come back
but
to the
but
money.
they do. And one of the issues that happened was that D-Ray became executive director. He got a board. Some of them said it was a board of mainly his friends. That was the accusation that was made by the two co-founders at the time. Brittany Packnett Cunningham left the organization in 2020 due to issues with messaging and also some of the stuff that was going on with their campaigns that she didn't agree with. And also, people began to be annoyed with Campaign Zero because they were pushing police reform at a time where abolition was growing in popularity. And this again was happening where BLM Global Network was getting their 90 million, Campaign Zero was getting their money too. D-Ray becomes executive director. He reduces the role of the other co-founders and fires them essentially.
Mm.
And there becomes some issues there. And so now Campaign Zero still exists. He still runs as executive director, but their steam and traction, in my view, looks like it has been slightly diminished based on the controversy and impact of the story I wrote, and also just the growing outrage about some of the stuff that came out of my story about how D. Ray managed Campaign Zero, how we got along with other co-founders. So it's a lot, but they're another group that when they started to restructure and reorganize, and big money came in, stuff started to get a little funny.
So I mean, it seems like again there's a recurring theme, and I hate to say this, but I'm saying for this conversation, money is the root of all evil. The actual Bible scripture is the love of money, but none the same for this right here. And it just seems like there's a lot of things lacking. And sadly, I mean, again, my interest in it is that I would love to see the black community be able to do more and better things. I would love the black community to be able to fight more efficiently and get more of the rights that they actually deserve. But we all know in order to fight, you need resources, i.e.,
Mm-hmm.
money. And when your accountability structures and leadership structures and financial structures aren't in alignment, that usually kind of damages things. And then plus, it seems like um, the reputational damage of this is how hurting the black community overall. And I always tell folks, I don't cover these things to poke at folks or take issues with dogging people. These are all learning lessons in my opinion, right? These are all learning lessons that everybody who's truly interested in organizing And organizing can go across a myriad of lanes, right? Whether it's a business, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's just simply marching. But if we do it better and we learn from our mistakes, if we learn from our mistakes, we can do it better. And so that's why I wanted to talk about this. And we'll probably talk about this some more. I mean, this is an abbreviated version of this. I
Abridged
actually
version, yeah.
can keep you all for 5 hours just talking all about this because one of the things, the issues that I know you covered with one of the co-founders at Campaign Zero was one of the co-founders, Sam, I believe it was doing all this analytical data, and there was a discrepancy about who owned it, whether he owned it or whether Campaign Zero owned it, and that's really interesting to me as well. That a black-led organization that is for the movement or the empowerment of black people actually wants to own the IP of the black producer, so to speak. I would think you would want it to be more equality driven. I
Mm-hmm.
guess I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean,
Well, I guess one. Can you speak to the issue they had with that
who, BLM or Campaign Zero?
Campaign Zero with owning the research data that Sam? I always say his last name wrong.
Yeah, Singway. So
Sam,
I would say that one of the issues there was that, that was a follow up story I did for the Daily Beast. And the issue that Sam had with D. Ray McKesson was that data that they have, it's it's a certain type of algorithm and structure. I don't know all but basically there's a system and it has to be curated a certain way to be vetted, right? And when Sam left as co-founder, he was the one managing it. That's the research that he was, doing himself,
right?
vetting to
He
make sure the
created it, right?
information is there. Say it again.
He created it.
He created that. Yeah, he
Yeah.
created that whole structure and platform, and he had a way of tracing that data to make sure it was accurate because this was used as a resource for people in the law field, policymakers. Everyone used it because they knew the data was pure. It was vetted. He was able to run it, and he still do. Issue is that when he got in partnership with Campaign Zero, the part of that partnership was that he was helping them generate that data and share it through Campaign Zero. So when you go on their website, the numbers will be updated, everything was together. That was part of what he brought to the table. He was always the data mastermind of the group. That was his brain. That was what he brought to the table. Um, when he left, D Ray appears that D Ray created a mirror, a mock-up of that same exact site, and yet the data there, we don't know who's running it. It's not
Mm.
Sam. We don't know if that information about that police tracking is off. Sam says it completely is. Um, I don't even know if they're even updating it. I don't even know if they have the team that is credible to actually run those numbers and do it the right way. So it looks like, based on the outface, that Sam, it's Sam still working it. The appearance of it looks like it's still his, but it's not. And so now that information that is there, we don't know if it's credible. We don't know if it's vettable. It's not a good resource anymore. Sam is still doing his thing, and so he's trying to direct people to his site. But because he didn't have the URL, he didn't own the domain. That is like he's had to create something completely different, like a domain, a name, or whatever. But that original domain, D-Ray has.
So he lost some of the brand equity.
Yeah, that's what it's looking like. But they're fighting it right now. I know that he previously threatened legal action to try to get his intellectual property back. But
And this algorithm, I know it tracks police data, um, uh, police shootings, and it was really like special in that way, like that it hasn't been seen before. Am I
yeah,
getting that right, or
no, you're
is there
correct.
anything else?
Yeah,
Okay,
you're correct. They were good at identifying and also identifying it. Like there were just other elements, like was the person armed or unarmed? Making sure the person was black, making sure that it wasn't like a shooting that wasn't involved where it was a shootout or something.
right.
Like they
Mm.
were making sure that it was actually real um, data that could actually be used in reference. So if we said there was this many police shootings, it wasn't like, oh, the person that we're identifying as data was a person that was shooting someone else. Like it was very earmarked and you know, because police are shooting every day, right? But in some cases, police might be actually in a shootout with a criminal or something, right?
That's
This was a situation,
justified. Yeah.
right? This was in a situation where they had this more vetted, and it was resourceful for people, right? People was able to use it and cite sources, make sure stuff was published, reports, policy reports, all that. That's not there. And so I don't really know what Campaign Zero is doing. I mean, they got some other people, I guess, trying to do it, but the credibility is really lost because he was really the brainchild of that. And when he left, rather than them just say, look, we gotta cut this, they wanted to keep it going. So there's people that really are under the impression, if they didn't read the piece or they haven't been following, they under the impression that stuff is still credible news.
Mm. Okay. Okay. Well, I got another question. Do you have any time to answer any questions? There's a couple questions in the chat.
Sure. Who's these questions by? Is the audience?
Yeah, by the audience. We live action fire right here.
Oh wow. Okay.
But before we get to that, with all the money issues, right, that you raised in your article and other articles as well, what should people do when they say, you know what, I want to support a Black Lives Matter, I want to support a Campaign Zero, I want to support any organization that is quote unquote trying to further the progression of Black people? What do you think they should be doing first and foremost?
Well, I will say, I just wrote a piece for the Daily Beast about this BLM financial problem. And one of the things I would encourage people to do is to give money locally, support organizations, nonprofits, and groups locally. That goes for everything, honestly. All politics is local. And I think that more people should really be invested in supporting local groups because, one, you can engage them better. They're going to be pushing issues and causes that speak more to your interests, right? And also, you just have a better metric of tracking the person, right? Like when I look at some of the stuff that's happened with companies and business, I think about Darius Crooks or Darius Cooks, depending on how you identify him, right? Better Business Bureau, you're right. There's local news that's like tracking them down and holding them accountable. So folks in Atlanta, they know about who this man is, if they want to support him or not. I think that's to be the same way that we look at nonprofits. Like I give my money to local nonprofits. I support local groups in my own backyard before I do anything national, because I've seen even in my organization, the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, which I'm a proud president of, that we see a lot of this money go to, like, when they go to national, there's this trickle down effect that never hits the people that need it. And even with BLM, right, a lot of these local chapters was not getting the money they should have gotten, or gotten more money. They deserve way more money to do the work they need to do. So I just think it's very important that we as a collective, as a group, really support local organizations and nonprofits in our neighborhoods and backyards, because I feel like you'll see more direct change that way than before. When I think about the local groups in my own life that I've supported, I've seen more policy change happen in city council, or even happen further with the work that was happening with them before anybody else. So I always just say go local with it. It's
Okay.
fancy to say national this, national that. That's all cool, but honestly, it's local is where it's at.
I mean, but sadly, right, these issues aren't just specific to Black Lives Matter. If you look at the
Right,
NAACP,
right.
they're having some of the same issues as well. So the question I feel, and for the record, since Ernest put it out there, we both are affiliated with the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists.
Yes.
I'm the treasurer,
Yes.
right? And so, again, this situation is interesting to me because these are actually conversations that Ernest and I are having, things that I'm actually worried about a lot of times, and I want to guard against, because once you start playing with Black folks and their money, it's a wrap, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and to me, the reputational or brand equity or potential losing of that is stifling to the overall community, along with the organization, right? It's a loss on many fronts. But there's a couple questions Couple I thought was hilarious. Um, I don't know, and I'm an Atlanta fan. If
Yeah,
anybody watches Atlanta with Donald Glover,
yeah, it
shout out to
is.
Citizen Jane. She said this sounds like a recent episode of Atlanta.
It is.
And what's so interesting about it, because I just watched, I don't know if anybody watches Atlanta with
I
Donald
do.
Glover, but for the rest of the audience, these episodes were shot way before this stuff happened. So
Hmm.
the sad part is a lot of
They
this
knew.
stuff has
We
been
know.
going on
We've
forever.
been. We've
Yeah,
been new. Like that's what I'm saying. We already knew. This was
yeah,
like what with that episode. This has been stuff that's been talked about behind closed doors for years, and journalists like myself has been wanting to talk about this for a while. I fortunately got to about Sean King for several years, but like it's hard, man, because everybody act like black journalists like myself and others don't want to tell these stories or don't know about them, and everybody always want to DM us about it. It's like, yo, we know, but like the targets on our backs to tell these stories, the backdoor politics of some of these famous people, the clout chasiness of some of your favorite personalities, which I won't even name them on this show, but they put themselves out there and block out voices like mine and others who are really trying to raise awareness on this stuff. So I 100% agree. It definitely all of that Atlanta episode 100% true. There are
gotcha.
that room when they're talking about clothes and what they want. I will tell you privately, it is happening. That has
It's real.
happened.
It's
Not
real.
that directing, but there is a similar situation in a room that actually happened in real life. Similar to that.
It's sadly it's been happening. I don't know. For y'all in the listening audience, let me know if y'all watch Atlanta or you have no clue what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's worth
Because
watching the episode.
I don't want to talk over y'all head.
Yeah,
Because God, it's so telling.
yeah.
All right, so Sister Jane said, well, before I do that, just what's up to everybody, Northern Bell, Kagoma. Um, Citizen Jane says, but if there isn't a leader who is responsible, everybody, right?
Everybody.
So everybody's got to take the weight.
Yeah,
Everybody.
everybody.
Yep.
Like I said, I think this is as a journalist, I think that the media had a role in this, right? Because, well, not me. Let me be clear: white people, white media, right, and black celebrities, yeah, because they, the issue is that there is this weird mentality of people want to look good, right? People want to look good. People want to be, people want to, it's clout chasing, right? People, they build relationships with people that they trust, and then when they find out that those people are untrustworthy, then rather than just say, okay, I gotta distance myself, people then go into protect mode. But the problem with protect mode is that yes, protecting people we care about matters, but there's also we're protecting them, but we're not holding them accountable. So okay, if you know that you got a friend that's doing some shady business, I gotta first make sure that I remove you from the equation. Like you can't be touching money then. They want to keep these people in power, but then they also want to protect them. There's got to be a consequence here. There's got to be some, accountability here, and I think that's often missed in our community for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that with this whole no snitching rhetoric nonsense. Because to be honest, everybody actually is snitching, but we believe that it's something to live by. That's a
Right,
whole other
right.
conversation. All right, so Citizen says, "But what was the money spent on?" So I kind of went over that on Thursday. I talked all about it. Um, so real quick, the $6 million home that everybody's talking about, I thought potentially had good um, intentions. Now, I can't say if they were really pure, though, right?
I don't know if you're supposed to put your contour on before.
Is you're talking about contour, dude?
That was in the background.
But $6 million mansion, like I talked about, and it was in a high affluent neighborhood of LA. Not sure how that's necessarily going to help the overall black community. I get that it was supposed to be a safe space. The other thing I pointed out that this is Black Lives Matter and they don't have a black accountant. I think that's really, really telling too. So there was a lot of things that were going on. The fact that they spent over $500,000 on legal fees, but only spent roughly $11,000 on accounting is also very telling. But check out that video. It's up on the YouTube channel. You can find it. You can find it. All right. So, yeah. Okay. So, Citizen, as I was going to ask about that, deliberate is the only thing it could be. Okay. Renell said there's a need for security, but not police. I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Now that's true, right? The white man's ice is colder. That is something that we have been programmed with since the days of Willie Lynch. But for the record, I don't believe that. I'm being a little sarcastic there, but it's as Ernest talked about, white media. It won't be believed until it gets in the white media, and that's an issue in and of itself.
Right.
King of Sorrows is agreeing. Welcome, welcome, welcome. What is the domain of Sam's current site? I don't know that. Do you know that, Ernest?
Yeah, it's in my
It's an article.
Yeah, it's in the article about but I will give you all the direct information. Policescorecard.org. So policescorecard.org is the site, direct site that he directs people to. It's called policescorecard.org. Yeah.
Right,
and that data is really good. It's updated. It's spot on. It's a go-to website. Like, I highly recommend. It's called policescorecard.org. That's his site.
Ooh. Okay. All right, let's put it up. Let's just share for everybody so they can see it. Police scorecard.
You get information with police departments and sheriff departments. They analyze data from 13,000 U.S. police departments nationwide. And you can even put in your state, and the information is there. He also has a donation link to support the work that he's doing. He has all the information. I mean, he scores them, and he breaks down his mythology. It's really dope. It's incredible work. Look at that. Yeah, it's really good stuff.
Oh yeah, we definitely have to check this out. Okay. All right, everybody. Policescorecard.
Police scorecard.
Thank you. Policescorecard.org. So make sure y'all share that out, right? One of the things that we do this reporting order so it can be shared out. This is positive information that everybody can use in our community.
Yeah.
All right, so we got that. Northern Bell says true. I have no clue about Atlanta. It's a TV show. It's a TV show. Yeah, if you ever watch my Twitter feed, I usually give some kind of reaction on it every week. It's weird but conscious all at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yes, it is.
And it's kind of brilliantly weird, right? It's not just, and it is kind of abstractly weird, but it's awesome. It's awesome. All right. But now, thank you for joining us on the bell. Hey, Elijah, over at Financial Anatomy. Well, Ernest, I will be remiss if we don't talk about this, and I'm not sure if I brought this up earlier. You are now amongst the best-selling author list for your new book, The Case for Cancel Culture. Can you give us a brief? Because I don't know when I'm going to be able to get this brother back, because he's out here moving and shaking.
We're just gonna put that there.
So he's gotten a whole new everything. Published deal, a real published deal, not self-published. No shade, because I might self-publish. But he's about to do a whole tour.
Self-publishing for people that do.
No, not at all. Not at all. But I'm just saying, like, there's some real heft behind this. So we out here moving.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
totally.
I publicly asked him to be one of his first interviews. So I'm gonna let y'all know I've asked to see if we can get him back on here to talk about this. But give everybody a brief synopsis about what the book is about.
So yeah, The Case for Cancel Culture. I can't, I know that the title is, very, I guess some people consider salacious, but honestly, to be real with you, I think we're at a point where This is the first major case for cancel culture as a fundamental means of democratic expression through history and timely necessity, right? I look at it as a necessity that is aimed at combating systems of oppression, right? Really, for me, the case for culture is a critical critique that really lends itself in favor of cancel culture as a tool for activism and change. I'm hoping that readers will reflect on and learn from our long history of counseling, right? The Boston Tea Party was council culture, right? The Civil War, in many ways, was council culture. And I really talk about how the left, the politically left and right, uniquely equip it as a part of their political toolkits, how the intersections of society wield it for justice, and ultimately how it levels the playing field for the everyday person's voice to matter, right? Like, why should we care? I believe so because we live in a world where protests and free speech are being challenged by the most powerful institutions. Those without power deserve to understand the nuance and importance of this democratic tool available to them. And that democratic tool to me is council culture. So I look at people like saying, rather than see it as a nasty byproduct of digital era, right? Everybody's always criticizing it, social media this, social media that. I look at it as a powerful tool for change. And I really work in this book to explain to people exactly how this has happened through examples from pop culture to politics to my own personal life experiences. So it's going to be a really great book. It comes out February 21st, 2023, but you can pre-order it now. And to Kamari's point earlier about the book being a bestseller, it was number one bestseller in new releases on Amazon when the pre-sale link dropped 3 weeks ago. So it's already doing really well. It's available on Amazon where books are sold. And I look forward to having more people find out about it and spread the word. This is the book cover. Again, The Case for Council Culture. It is available on Kindle and on hardcover, so you can order either or right now. And yeah, I just hope for your support.
All right, so you're telling me the Montgomery bus boycotts was a form of cancel culture?
We talk about that in my book. Yes.
Interesting.
But and in my book, we talk about everything. Everybody in the book. Everybody in the book. We talk about
everything. Today.
We talk about Sean King. We talk about R. Kelly. We talk about Harvey Weinstein. We talk about everybody. Okay. We talk about everybody. Everybody gets this work in this book. I think Woody Allen's in the book. We talk about everybody in the book. And I interviewed some really great people as well. Some familiar voices and people you've heard of and know for sure. I won't tell who they are yet, but I interviewed some people to give their take on cancel culture, people who've been canceled, people who thought they were canceled. I mean, we talk about everybody in the book. So it's a lot of great examples and stuff. But honestly, what I want to do is I want to just change the conversation around what we think cancel culture is and really redefine it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Will it be available on audiobook at some point?
I can't say that right now, but
so that's probably a yes, y'all.
I can't say that.
He didn't say it, I said it.
I can't say that. But you can get this now and then, audio maybe soon. So.
Okay. Well, Mr. Ernest Owens, thank you for coming on and breaking down BLM from a broad facet, right? From Black Lives Matter's Global Network Foundation to Operation Zero. So it was very enlightening. Hopefully all of you all gotten something out of this. And hopefully, right, we can use this as an opportunity to learn how not to do crazy things when we're running these organizations. All right. So again, thank you everyone for watching the Finance Rebel Show. And I will be back really, really soon. Y'all have a great Sunday. So long.
Thank you.